Hey, my friends.
5 years is a long time for a son to treat his father like a ghost, but David always did have a talent for selective memory. He didn't just miss my birthdays. He erased my presents from his calendar as if my life were a debt he no longer intended to pay. I've learned that when a man stops looking you in the eye, he's usually busy looking at your assets instead. Martha and I didn't spend our energy shouting into the void or asking for crumbs of his time. We simply withdrew, traded our old life for a secluded house on the coast, and let the silence become our strongest wall. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. We are 65, not dead, and certainly not as oblivious as David's arrogance led him to believe. He assumed we were rotting in some overpriced retirement home, waiting for the end while he planned how to spend our legacy. He didn't know that every time he checked our old address, we were watching his frustration through a screen from 300 miles away. Tonight, his sleek black SUV finally crunched the gravel of our new driveway, a predator arriving to claim what he thought was an abandoned carcass. He used a key he stole from our old drawer years ago, confident that the house was empty and the spoils were his for the taking. I sat in the darkness of the library, the glow of the security monitors being the only light in the room. He stepped inside, his footsteps heavy with the confidence of a thief who thinks he already owns the building. My pulse didn't quicken. I've survived enough storms to know that the calm is where the real power lies. He reached for the light switch, his hand trembling slightly with greed, unaware that I was already watching his every move from the shadows. David fumbled for the foyer light panel like a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. I sat in the shadows of the library, the familiar weight of a father's disappointment settling in my chest, though it was spiked with a dry, internal laugh. Just an hour ago, I tried to execute a silent patrol of the hallway and ended up nearly taking a header over the cat's water fountain. There's a particular kind of indignity in trying to be a silent guardian of your own home while wearing fleece-lined slippers that squeak on the hardwood. I'd spent 10 minutes swearing under my breath, wondering if James Bond ever had to deal with a Siamese cat who treats a tactical retreat as an invitation to play. But as David stepped further into the house, the humor vanished, replaced by a cold, vibrating anxiety that I refused to let show. My hands were steady on the armrests, even as my mind raced through the implications of his presence here, 300 miles from where he thought we were. He looked tired, his expensive suit wrinkled and his eyes darting around the room with a frantic, hungry energy. It's a strange thing to look at your own child and feel the same caution you give to a stranger holding a match in a hayloft. I remember the weight of him in my arms as a baby, but tonight, all I felt was the weight of the 5 year silence he'd built between us. Martha was upstairs, likely watching the feed on her tablet with that terrifyingly calm expression she wears when she's about to win a game of bridge. She always told me I was too soft on him, and as I watched him reach for a silver vase on the sideboard, I realized she was, as usual, entirely right. My heart beat with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a clock counting down to a moment of no return. He didn't hear me breathe, but he was starting to realize the air in here wasn't stagnant or dusty. The scent of Martha's lavender candles and my pipe tobacco filled the space, a living signature he couldn't ignore. I leaned forward, the leather of my chair giving a low, ominous groan that cut through the silence like a verdict. He spun around, the color draining from his face as his eyes searched the darkness of the library. The predatory look in his eyes flickered, replaced by a raw, primal fear that told me the games were officially over. David didn't just come to check on an empty house. He came with a tape measure and the soul of a liquidator. He pulled out his phone, and the speaker was loud enough for me to hear Sarah's sharp, impatient voice vibrating through the room. I watched him pace the rug, already mentally rearranging our furniture and discussing the market value of a home he hadn't spent a single cent to maintain. It was the first real sting of injustice, hearing my own flesh and blood speak of our life's work as if it were a pile of scrap metal waiting for a buyer. I tried to shift my weight to get a better angle, and my smartwatch, a gift from Martha that I still don't fully trust, decided at that exact moment to loudly announce my heart rate. I had to muffle the glowing screen against my thigh. cursing the Silicon Valley engineer who thought a man needed his wrist to talk back to him during a stealth operation. If I was going to be caught, I'd prefer it wasn't because of a piece of plastic telling me I was stressed. I watched David walk over to my mahogany desk, the one he used to do his homework on, and casually toss his car keys onto the polished surface like he was the new king of the castle. He started opening drawers, looking for the deed, or perhaps the jewelry he assumed we'd left behind in our confusion. He told Sarah they'd have the estate settled by the end of the month, his voice devoid of a single ounce of grief or hesitation. It's a bitter pill to swallow when you realize your son views your disappearance not as a tragedy, but as a convenient shortcut to a bigger bank account. I didn't move, letting the cold clarity of his betrayal settle into my bones like a winter frost. I've dealt with corporate sharks and dishonest contractors, but none had the sheer audacity of a child who thinks his parents have finally become obsolete. He thinks he's playing a game of speed, but he's forgotten that I'm the one who taught him how to keep score. He moved toward the safe hidden behind the painting, his fingers tracing the frame with a practiced greed that made my blood run cold. David was sweating now, his fingers fumbling with the dial of the wall safe behind a seascape painting. He actually thought I'd keep the combination as his birthday, the very date he'd treated as a chore for the last half-decade. I watched him struggle, a dry smirk forming on my face as he tried 10 to 24 for the third time, failing to realize that I'd replaced sentiment with strategy years ago. My left foot chose that exact second to fall asleep, sending 1,000 needles up my calf. I had to bite my lip to keep from making a sound, performing a slow, agonizingly deliberate ankle roll that felt more like a low-budget interpretive dance than a tactical maneuver. If anyone saw a 65-year-old man doing the wave with his foot in the dark, they'd think I'd finally lost my marbles. But the stakes were too high for a clumsy thud. David growled into his phone, telling Sarah that the old man probably forgot the code himself and hid the gold in his mattress. It's fascinating how quickly children turn you into a caricature of senility when it suits their financial narrative. I've built companies and survived recessions, yet to my own son, I'm just a faulty hard drive waiting to be wiped. He kicked the baseboard in frustration, a childish display of temper that reminded me exactly why I never gave him the keys to the family business. He didn't see this house as a home. He saw it as a puzzle box that was refusing to give up its prize. Every time he insulted my mind, my resolve hardened into something as cold and unbreakable as the steel door he was fighting. I didn't need to yell. The silence of his failure was a more powerful rebuke than any lecture I could have delivered. He finally stopped, panting, and reached for a heavy brass letter opener on the desk, his eyes narrowing with a dark, desperate intent. The air in the library grew thick with a new, sharper kind of danger as he realized that simple theft wasn't going to be enough. He didn't just want the money anymore. He wanted to break something of mine, and his hand moved toward the portrait of my father. The canvas rippled as he pressed the blade against the frame, and I knew that if I didn't act soon, he would destroy the only things that couldn't be replaced. David's laugh was a dry, hollow sound that filled the room, the kind of noise a man makes when he thinks he's already won. He stayed on the line with Sarah, his voice dripping with a condescending pity that felt like a physical blow to my pride. "You should see this place, Sarah. It's a shrine to a man who didn't know when to step aside," he sneered, tossing a stack of my old journals onto the floor like they were yesterday's trash. "It's a profound humiliation to listen to your own child describe your life's work as a cluttered mess and your wisdom as rambling nonsense." I sat there, forced to witness the systematic dismantling of my dignity, while suddenly realizing I was still wearing my grill master apron under my cardigan. I'd forgotten to take it off after helping Martha with the brisket earlier, and nothing kills the vibe of a high-stakes confrontation quite like a hidden illustration of a dancing hot dog against your ribs. It was a ridiculous, human moment that reminded me why I was fighting, to protect a life that was real, messy, and entirely mine. David grabbed my favorite fountain pen, a gift from my own father, and used it to impatiently pry at the backing of the portrait. He's probably drooling into a bowl of oatmeal somewhere right now. Sarah's voice crackled through the phone. "Just sign the papers as his legal guardian, and let's move on." The air in the room felt thin, charged with the static of his arrogance and my growing, icy resolve. I watched him treat my heritage like a scratch-off lottery ticket, his eyes devoid of any recognition of the man who had raised him. My hands were balled into fists, not out of weakness, but out of a sudden, clarifying necessity to end this farce. He didn't see me as a person anymore, just an obstacle between him and a bank balance he hadn't earned. He leaned in close to the safe again, his breath fogging the metal, convinced that my supposed senility was his greatest ally. He was so busy celebrating my demise that he didn't notice the library door, which I'd left unlatched, slowly beginning to swing shut on its own. The heavy click of the latch echoed like a gunshot in the silent room, and David froze, the letter opener still clutched in his hand like a weapon. The click of the door latch was loud, but David's gasp was louder, the sharp, ragged sound of a guilty conscience finally catching up with a coward. He spun around, the brass letter opener held out in front of him like he was expecting a burglar, unaware that the only thief in this room was himself. I watched him from the shadows of my wingback chair, feeling a strange, hollow snap inside my chest. The final thread of fatherly hope had finally given way. It wasn't a moment of sadness, but a cold, surgical realization that the boy I'd taught to ride a bike had been replaced by a man who would gladly sell my soul for a down payment. My left leg began to throb from the stillness, and I had to suppress a dry laugh, realizing that stealth is a much more graceful endeavor in movies than it is for a man who forgot to stretch after his evening walk. I briefly wondered if my dramatic reveal would be ruined by my knee clicking like a castanet, a reminder that even a predator's machinery requires regular maintenance. David began to mutter to himself, his voice cracking as he whispered Sarah's name into the phone, seeking courage from a woman who was likely already browsing luxury car catalogs. He started walking toward my chair, his footsteps hesitant and heavy, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark stain on my sanctuary. I could see the sweat glistening on his brow in the dim light of the security monitors, the raw, animal panic of someone who realizes he is no longer alone in a house he thought he'd conquered. He stopped just 3 feet away, the air between us thick with 5 years of unsaid words and the sharp, metallic tang of his fear. I didn't blink or breathe, letting the silence exert its own crushing pressure until I could hear the frantic rhythm of his heart. I felt a sudden, dry irony. I'd spent decades building a legacy for him, only to find myself hiding from it in the dark like a stowaway on my own ship. This was the moment I understood that being a parent isn't always about protection. Sometimes, it's about knowing when the fire you started needs to be extinguished. He reached out a trembling hand toward the back of my chair, his fingers inches from the leather, desperate to prove that the ghost in the room was just his imagination. I waited until his fingertips brushed the material, the ultimate violation of my peace, before I allowed my own hand to move. I gripped his wrist with a strength that didn't come from muscles, but from 50 years of hard-earned authority, and I felt his entire body go rigid. David's wrist felt like a dry twig in my hand, brittle and vibrating with a terror that I found strangely pathetic. I stood up slowly, not because I was stiff, but because I wanted him to feel every inch of my height as I emerged from the shadows. "Looking for something, David?" I asked, my voice as steady as the tide, catching him just as he tried to stifle a scream. He fell backward, tripping over my stack of vintage woodworking journals, and for a split second, I felt a flash of genuine annoyance that he'd bent the cover of the issue on dovetail joints. It's a challenge to maintain the aura of an intimidating patriarch when your son is currently losing a wrestling match with a glossy article about artisanal chisels. I didn't help him up. I simply looked down at him with the same clinical detachment I'd used to inspect a diseased branch on an otherwise healthy oak. The phone was still in his hand, Sarah's muffled voice demanding to know what the thump was, but David could only stare at me, his mouth hanging open like a broken mailbox. 5 years of silence, I said, leaning in so he could see the total lack of warmth in my eyes. And you break it not with a hello, but with a thief's key. This wasn't the righteous anger of a victim. This was the cold, calculated fury of a man who realized he'd spent his life building a temple for a vandal. I watched the greed in his eyes turn into a frantic search for an excuse, his brain trying to construct a lie that wouldn't crumble under the weight of my presence. He started to stammer about checking on our safety, but I silenced him by merely raising one eyebrow, a gesture that had ended board meetings in seconds back in the day. I could have roared at him, but there is more power in a whisper that carries the weight of 5 years of observation. He was a stranger to me now, a biological error that I was finally ready to correct with the surgical precision of a man who has nothing left to lose. I took the phone from his limp fingers and pressed the end call button, cutting off Sarah's toxic babble with a single, satisfying click. "Your mother is waiting in the kitchen. David," I whispered, the words hanging in the air like a cold mist. "And God help you, because I'm the one who actually likes you. She's the one you should really be afraid of." David scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting toward the exit, but the heavy thud of the kitchen door swinging open told him the perimeter was already sealed. He was no longer the guest of this house. He was the evidence.
I was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of soup that smelled far better than David's excuses ever did. I didn't turn around when the kitchen door swung open. I knew the sound of his panicked, shallow breathing as clearly as a composer knows a discordant note. Motherhood is a long, expensive lesson in learning to recognize the specific frequency of your child's lies, and David was currently broadcasting at a fever pitch. Earlier, I'd spent 10 minutes wrestling with a new jar of artisanal pickles, a battle I nearly lost until I used a heavy spoon to break the vacuum seal. But facing my son felt much simpler than a stubborn lid. I finally turned, the steam from the pot framing me like a ghost from a past he thought he'd buried under his debts and his arrogance. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw the boy who used to hide broken vases behind the sofa, foolishly believing the silence would fix the cracks. "Hello, David," I said, my voice as calm as the ocean before a landslide. "I see you've finally found your way to the coast without needing a GPS or a conscience." He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a single finger, a gesture that had silenced rooms full of ambitious men back when I was still running the firm. I am 62 years old, and my patience hasn't thinned with age. It has simply become more selective about what it tolerates. I watched him look around for a chair, but I didn't offer him one, making him stand in the harsh, unforgiving light of a truth he wasn't prepared to face. There is a specific kind of cold that settles in a mother's heart when she realizes her womb carried a man who would gladly trade her warmth for a thicker wallet. I took a slow sip of my tea, the heat a stark contrast to the icy judgment I held for the stranger standing in my kitchen. I wasn't mourning the loss of a son tonight. I was assessing the damage to my home and deciding exactly how to prune this dead weight from our lives. He tried to step toward me, but the look in my eyes pinned him to the floor like a specimen in a glass case. "Robert is the storm that breaks the branches, but I am the frost that kills the roots," and David was just beginning to feel the chill. He glanced toward the back door, searching for a path to retreat, but I'd already moved the key to my apron pocket, right next to the phone that had been recording his every word since he crossed the threshold. David's eyes were darting toward the sink, as if he expected a secret exit to manifest in the plumbing. I set my teacup down with a deliberate click, a sound that seemed to make him wince more than a scream would have. It's a strange thing to realize your son has become a caricature of a corporate villain, all sweat, expensive cologne, and no substance. I'd actually intended to greet him with a bit more theatricality, but I'd spent the last 5 minutes in a silent battle with our new smart refrigerator, which was insisting that we were out of eggs when I was clearly looking at a dozen. There is a certain hilarity in trying to maintain the aura of a formidable matriarch while your kitchen appliances are having a localized existential crisis, but I didn't let the blinking red light distract me from my target. David finally found his voice, a thin, wavering thing that reminded me of a broken reed in a swamp. "Mom, you don't understand. The firm is in a temporary bind," he started, but I cut him off with a look that could have curdled the milk he was so desperate to steal. "I know exactly how much trouble he is in, including the fact that he's been using Sarah's maiden name to hide a secondary mortgage on a house he doesn't even own. He didn't realize that while he was busy ignoring our birthdays, I was busy having monthly lunches with his head of accounting, a woman who remembers the tuition checks I used to sign. I've survived 3 recessions and one husband who thinks he can fix a leak with duct tape and a prayer. A greedy son with a gambling problem is hardly a challenge. He thinks he's the architect of his own destiny, but he's just a child playing with matches in a house built from his parents' sacrifices." I watched the realization dawn on him, the fact that I had been monitoring his financial collapse with the same clinical interest I used to watch the evening news. His hands shook as he reached for the counter, finally understanding that the helpless woman he intended to exploit was actually the one holding his leash. He didn't know that the papers he was so desperate to find weren't in the safe at all, but were already sitting on a desk at the district attorney's office. David looked at the kitchen door as if he could melt the wood with his sheer desperation, but the exit remained firmly shut. I didn't feel pity. I felt the kind of detached curiosity one has for a laboratory specimen that has finally hit a dead end in a maze. You've always been a mediocre liar, David, mainly because you assume everyone else is as shallow as you are, I said, leaning against the counter with a poise that felt like armor. At 62, I've learned that the loudest people are usually the ones with the emptiest pockets and the dirtiest hands. Behind him, Robert tried to make a silent, dramatic entrance from the hallway, but he accidentally caught his cardigan on the brass door handle, resulting in a muffled oof and a frantic, undignified tug-of-war with the woodwork. It's difficult to maintain a chilling atmosphere when your partner in crime is essentially being held hostage by a piece of knitwear, but I didn't let my expression flicker. I simply pulled a small, silver flash drive from my apron pocket and set it on the marble island between us like a poisoned chalice. This isn't just a record of your calls to Sarah, David. It's a digital paper trail of every company account you've bled dry while pretending we didn't exist. His face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray, the sweat now visibly staining the collar of that $1,000 shirt I likely paid for. I watched him realize that we hadn't just vanished to hide from the world. We had moved here to provide him with enough rope to hang his own reputation. There is no silence louder than the one that follows a total loss of leverage. I walked closer, my heels clicking on the tile with a rhythmic, military precision that signaled the end of his reign. He reached for the drive, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, but I covered it with my hand before his trembling fingers could even graze the metal. "Don't touch what isn't yours," I whispered. "You've done quite enough of that already." I reached for the wall-mounted intercom and pressed the button that connected directly to the security gate where 2 cars were already waiting. David's knees finally gave way, and for the first time in 5 years, he looked at me with the eyes of a child who realized the consequences were finally real. David tried to stand up, his ego clawing for one last foothold in a room that had become his courtroom. "You can't do this, Martha. You're my parents, not the police," he hissed, the entitlement finally curdling into something sharp and ugly. I watched him with a clinical eye, marveling at the sheer audacity of a man who thinks blood is a get-out-of-jail-free card for a decade of betrayal. Robert finally entered from the hallway, having successfully detached his cardigan from the door handle, though a single loose thread now trailed from his sleeve like a tiny, domestic white flag he refused to acknowledge. He tried to lean casually against the refrigerator to look intimidating, but he misjudged the distance and had to perform a quick, rhythmic shuffle to regain his balance. He played it off with a stern nod, as if his brief stumble were a sophisticated tactical maneuver designed to keep David off balance. "The gate is locked, David, and I've already disabled your car's remote start," Robert said, his voice dropping into that deep, mahogany register that used to terrify his junior executives. David looked between us, finally realizing he wasn't facing 2 senile retirees, but 2 seasoned hunters who had been setting this trap since the first year he stopped calling. He started to babble about family legacy and how we were destroying his future, as if his future weren't already a charred ruin of his own making. "A legacy is earned through respect, not inherited through neglect," I replied, my voice slicing through his excuses like a cold scalpel. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the desperate search for a loophole or a moment of motherly softness that simply no longer existed. He reached for his phone again, but Robert simply held up the router's power cord, giving it a playful, knowing waggle that was both infuriating and final. My son looked at us as if we were strangers, and for the first time in my life, I felt the profound relief of the feeling being entirely mutual. I didn't need a lawyer to tell me what happens next. I just needed my son to understand that the bank of mom and dad was permanently closed for business. David's eyes darted toward the heavy kitchen window, his hand tightening around the brass letter opener he brought from the library. He was weighing the distance to the glass, unaware that I'd had it replaced with reinforced acrylic the month we moved in. David lunged toward the kitchen window, the brass letter opener raised in a desperate arc, but the impact against the reinforced acrylic produced only a dull, mocking thud. He rebounded off the pane with a look of pure, unadulterated shock, his shoulder absorbing the vibration of a house that refused to let him break it. Robert stepped into the light to intercept him, attempting to project the formidable presence of a man who had once commanded 1,000 employees. However, the gravity of his stride was slightly hindered by his smart orthopedic slippers, which chose that precise moment to emit a frantic, high-pitched low battery chirp. He paused mid-step, his face a mask of stern authority while his left foot continued to beep like a lost microwave, an absurdity I would have found hilarious if my heart wasn't turning to stone. I didn't move from the island, watching my son struggle to reconcile his father's stoicism with a chirping slipper. It was the ultimate domestic tragedy. "You're not trapped by these walls, David," I said, my voice cutting through the electronic peeping with a cold, surgical precision. "You're trapped by the fact that you've run out of people who believe in your lies." He looked at the blade in his hand, then at the two people who had given him everything, and I saw the final flicker of his humanity vanish behind a veil of pure, jagged resentment. The threat wasn't the physical weapon, but the realization that the son I had loved was entirely gone, replaced by a stranger who saw us as nothing more than a stubborn debt. I felt a hollow ache, not for the money he'd stolen, but for the decades of motherly concern I had wasted on a man who was now calculating the weight of a cast-iron pot. Robert finally stooped down and yanked the beeping slipper off, standing in one sock with a grim, barefooted dignity that was somehow more terrifying than a weapon. We stood our ground, a lopsided but unbreakable front, as David's eyes fixed on the boiling soup on the stove. He took a slow, menacing step toward the burner, and I realized he wasn't looking for an exit anymore. He was looking for a way to make sure no one won. David's hand hovered over the stove, his eyes burning with the frantic light of a man who would rather see the world end than admit he's lost. "One more step, and I'll take this whole place down with me," he hissed, but I just watched him with the same boredom I have for a TV drama I've seen 3 times. Robert was still standing there in one sock, trying to look like a man about to deliver a knockout blow, though he was currently leaning slightly to the left to compensate for the uneven height. He caught my eye and gave a small, sheepish shrug as if to say, "The things we do for family," before regaining his stony composure with admirable speed. Experience teaches you that speed is often just a mask for panic, and we were the only ones in the room who weren't panicking. I didn't flinch when he grabbed the handle of the cast-iron pot. I knew exactly how heavy that Dutch oven was because I'm the one who seasoned it for 20 years. "David, do you really think you can outplay a woman who survived 40 years of your father's innovative home repairs?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the tiled room. Just then, the smoke alarm, which I'd accidentally set to high sensitivity while trying to toast sourdough this morning, let out a piercing, rhythmic chirp. The sound was ridiculous, a domestic bird call in the middle of a standoff, but I used the distraction to step into his personal space, as unmovable as a cliff. He hesitated, the noise breaking his concentration, and in that split second, I saw the cowardice that had always lived under his expensive suits. There is no heartbreak left when you realize you're looking at a ghost of your own making, just the clean, sharp need to finish the job. I reached out, not to strike him, but to calmly turn the burner knob to off, the simple click sounding like a gavel hitting a bench. The heat was gone, and so was his leverage. He looked down at the cold burner, the realization sinking in that he was no longer the one in control of the temperature in this room. The sound of sirens began to bleed through the roar of the waves outside, getting louder with every passing second. Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, neatly folded document that would change David's life forever. The flashing blue and red lights began to pulse against the kitchen window, casting a rhythmic, cold glow over the wreckage of David's pride. He sat slumped in the chair I hadn't offered him, his expensive suit looking like a costume that no longer fit the man wearing it. Robert walked over, still heroically balancing on one bare foot, and placed the document on the marble island with the quiet finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. I really should have checked the firmware on those slippers before the confrontation. The tech support guy is going to hear about this, Robert muttered under his breath, his dry wit intact despite the chaos. I felt a surge of genuine affection for my husband, a man who could face a family betrayal and a malfunctioning footwear battery with the same unflinching irony. David didn't even look at the paper, which outlined the total revocation of his trust and the legal transfer of his debts to his own name. He looked at us, as if he were seeing us for the first time, not as bank accounts or obstacles, but as the people who had taught him everything he'd used against us. I felt a profound lightness in my chest, the kind of clarity that only comes when you finally stop carrying a weight that was never yours to bear. The officers knocked on the door, their presence a formal punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. We didn't need to exchange words of anger or dramatic farewells. The silence we had lived in for 5 years was now his to navigate alone. As they led him toward the driveway, he looked back once, but I was already turning back to the stove to finish the soup. The house felt larger, cleaner, and finally, after half a decade of waiting, it felt entirely like ours again. We weren't broken by his greed or slowed by our years. We were simply finished with the burden of his expectations. Robert put his arm around my shoulders, his one-socked foot leaving a soft print on the tile, and we watched the tail lights fade into the coastal mist. We had lost a son years ago, but tonight, we had finally won back our peace.